Hey guys, how's it going? I think if we've learned one thing here, VR is easy and PowerPoint is really fucking hard. Apparently. So I'm Nick Blining, Technical Director of VRAR at Epic Games. Thank you. The session title here said, designing for interaction and motion controls. And I thought it would be really useful to kind of frame that in a practical example, because with things VR, I find it very likely the theory and the practice don't always line up. And you kind of got to run into the brick wall over and over and over again until you fall down and pass out. And you wake up and you have a good idea one day. So we made a demo called Bullet Train. Has anybody here played Bullet Train? Oh, nice. A few people. That's good. That's good. So I'm going to go kind of frame the context of the discussion in that. And I'm going to start about how we got here, just a quick, brief summary of our experience in VR, so you can see that we're just as fresh as everybody else and we're all learning here. Go over some of the project goals for what Bullet Train was supposed to become, or what our ideas were, because that helps frame the discussion of how we design the interactions. Then get into the kind of design considerations and tricks that we did with playing with motion controls for the first time. And if we have time, I'll go over some technical and performance optimizations. Even though it wasn't on the docket, I think that's one of the most important things, is maintaining 90 frames a second. Everybody knows how important it is not to make people sick. And so there's a few tricks that we did that were kind of old school hacks that we brought into modern gaming. So I'll try to hit those if we have time. So how do we get here? So about in E3 2003, the guys from Oculus said, hey, we got this cool new headset, we're going to make it HD. We need some content for it. And so I said, hey, we got some content. So we took a tech demo that we did for GDC to kind of announce Unreal Engine 4, which is our main engine product, and decided just to throw it in VR. So it's kind of our baby step in there. You couldn't do a whole lot. You could kind of walk around and turn around, look at the pretty castle and stuff. But it was really simple, and at that point, it was just kind of proving out the tech. And then they came up with the Crystal Cove prototype, which was kind of the precursor to the Crescent Bay and the DK2, which had positional tracking. And that was kind of, one of those aha moments of VR for me, when you can actually look around and lean in and see stuff. So we made this game we called Strategy VR. And in order to try to encourage people to look around and move their head, we put a really tiny world in front of you and a really big world around you, so that we figured you'd want to lean in and see the little tiny people. So we had little dwarves going down through this little gauntlet. You could press buttons and they exploded and stuff. So the goal was to make people lean in and actually bump their heads on the table. And we said if we got anybody to do that on camera, it would be success. And we got one of the major tech publications to bump their head on the table. And so we had great success. After that, for the debut of the DK2, we made a little game called Couch Nights. And that was basically, we wanted to do multiplayer presence in VR. So we wanted to have the head tracking information from one player kind of set up on the other player, so you can see other people moving around and kind of get the subtle body language that comes with that. So we made Couch Nights, and we can actually download it for free and see how we built it and kind of dissect it and take it apart. After that, for Oculus Connect 2014, when Oculus was debuting their Crescent Bay hardware, we wanted something to really kind of blow out the visuals on it, since it was such a nice screen and such nice hardware, and NVIDIA just came out with the 980. So we made Showdown, which was kind of a cinematic piece where you're flying through this action zone, and there's actually only 7 seconds of content in there, but it's slowed down so much that it lasts for about 1 minute and 45 seconds. So it's cool because you're kind of going through this action scene, there's bullets flying all around you, and every time you go through, you can look at a different thing. And then for GDC this year, we collaborated with Weta Digital, the guys that did all the effects on the Lord of the Rings games, or not games, movies. And we really wanted to see how far could we push our pipeline, right? So we took the Smaug dragon from the movies and put him in VR and did a lot of cool tricks in order to make him renderable in VR. So you can have a giant dragon that's the size of 2 747s or however big he is kind of come up and talk to you. And it's really kind of a cool, novel experience, and let us kind of explore what it's like to get into the linear space a little bit, because there's been a lot of interest around that. And after that, we work a lot with external partners, Oculus Story Studio, Henry and Lost, if you've seen the adorable little hedgehog, that's all UE4 and whatnot. So we spend a lot of time kind of working with external developers. And CCP, Eve Valkyrie and Gunjack are two of the coolest titles out on the Gear VR, and coming with all the Oculus Rifts, in fact, they just announced. So we spend a lot of time kind of working with those external partners, seeing what their struggles are, helping them through, learning a bit ourselves, and trying to disseminate that knowledge to everyone. And so Bullet Train, we released at Oculus Connect 2015 just a few months ago, and it was our first foray into kind of what's possible when you can actually have motion controls and actualization in the world. So for a lot of you that haven't seen Bullet Train, I've got a quick video that's just kind of a run through of the gameplay. Hopefully everything works. New computer, it's always fun.
We are now pulling into the rail station. Be alert. The enemy will be waiting for you.
Freeze!
Grab and throw bullets.
as you can see, it's a game about diplomacy. But I wanted to kind of go over, some of the design considerations and tricks that we did in order to kind of create the experience that we did. So if you look at all of our previous efforts, the one thing that they all have in common is that they have adapted content. So we took bits and parts from other tech demos, other games and stuff that we're working on, and kind of kit bashed it together to make games. Because all those demos that we did previously were done in 4 to 5 weeks with 2, 3 guys max and whatnot. So we decided, since we have something new with the Oculus Touch, why don't we just go ahead and create something new on the content side as well. So the design considerations for Bullet Train is kind of handed down from on high, where we needed to really raise the visual bar on Showdown. But unlike Showdown, which was running on an NVIDIA 980, we had to run on the Oculus recommended spec hardware, which meant we had to get it to look better and run on a 970. The other thing was we had mostly new content, and motion controllers were obviously new. But the biggest thing we wanted to do with this was kind of dog food the engine. So use the engine that we make ourselves, find all the things that make us curse ourselves, and then fix all those things and make them better for everybody else. The scenario constraints for Bullet Train is that they didn't want a sequel to Showdown. They felt, Showdown had its day, it's run its course, so we needed something totally new. Engaging gameplay that can only be done with the motion controller. So now that we had these motion controllers and you could pick up and touch things in the world, what are the interesting things we can do with that really will change people's perspective on VR? And all that mostly new content that we talked about, by the way, it had to be done in 6 weeks by a guy who'd never worked in games before. So that was an interesting challenge. So what should we do? When we started prototyping, one of our first inspirations was the old NES Zapper game, Hogan's Alley, where it was just kind of a 2D shooting gallery. So we set up a 3D shooting gallery with just a bunch of weapons, and then had AI kind of coming at you, and you just kind of took them out, and you were standing there. And it was kind of cool because it was fun just to have the weapons in your hands and shoot stuff and see it blow up in VR. I mean, that's always fun. But standing in one place got kind of boring. Even if we put it in cool visual effects, you're still standing in the same place. And you're like, okay, people are coming. I'm shooting them. Is anything new happening? And it got pretty boring pretty quick. So we said, okay, we did that idea. Let's try another one. So we actually looked at Asian action films. So if you've seen a lot of kind of Korean or Chinese movies, one of the famous things that they do are these long one-shots where the camera never breaks action, but it's going through a scene and there's just all sorts of stuff coming on. And some of them can last upwards of 7 to 10 minutes in the most extreme cases. But even the smaller ones are just really cool because you have that kind of continued sense of action, and it feels like a fight is kind of grating on you. This is an example from a Korean film called Old Boy, where this guy is just kind of going down a hall beating up a bunch of people. So one of the things we were thinking about, the previous where we were standing still, you didn't have any movement, and that was boring. So this was a way that we can move people through the environment, have people jumping out, do cool scripted one-off animations, and have a lot of kind of cool fun. So we thought we could also make the action a little bit more dynamic by taking you through and kind of changing the camera angles. You got to be a little careful about that, though, because you can make the player barf pretty easily. But we did some experiments where if you moved towards something and then flashed the camera as you do the reorientation, it wasn't too bad. So it was actually pretty cool. The advantages of that were that the movement through the environment keeps things interesting. You're not staring at the same stuff all the time, and you can have people jump out and surprise you. We also discovered that one of the cool things was chaining gameplay for people. So as you're beating up one person, you punch him, you might take his gun and then use that to, clob the next guy on the head, and then take his baton and beat the next guy. So people were doing these chains of actions as they went through this environment. And it was really kind of cool and fun and unexpected for us that would actually be a cool thing, but it was kind of emergent as we watched people do the playtests through it. And the other nice thing, given those constraints on time and staffing, the content, the animation, and the AI scripting needs were pretty constrained because we controlled the scene, we controlled the camera, the same thing could happen every time. We didn't need to, make a full AI that could go through and navigate an environment. We could say, hey, this guy pops out the window, and every time he's gonna pop out the window. So, as I mentioned before, theory and practice are oftentimes different. So what happened when we tried it? So it was really cool when you're standing in manipulating stationary objects in you. But if you imagine you're kind of traversing through an environment, you're punching one guy and you're starting to pass him because you have no control over your motion, so you start to turn to the right. And that presents a problem with the tracking on the Oculus Touch, because if you look at this diagram, if you imagine this is the wall, this is the player, he's had a little too many Doritos, so he's a little tubby. He's got his hands out here with the motion controllers and his headset there. As long as these blue trackers have line of sight to all those things, they can be tracked. But as soon as you lose line of sight, like when you move, suddenly this motion controller in the right hand can no longer be seen by the trackers, and that means you lose tracking. And one of the biggest things you can do to break immersion with tracking, or with these motion controllers, is to lose tracking, right? It's so cool, and then your hand flies off like a rocket, and you're like, whoa, that's not right, especially when it's part of you, and especially when you get the hand presence right, you feel like the hands are part of you, and so when the part of you just goes flying off, it's just a little disconcerting to people. So ultimately that idea was no good, but we did learn a few things, that the movement was the key to actually keeping this fun and visually interesting. And like in Showdown, if you're very careful and deliberate about how you're controlling the non-player controlled motion, you can actually get away with it. The biggest thing we found, and this is it's true in Showdown with our moving camera, is we need to start them moving right away and then fade in, right? If you start them from a stop and then just jerk them straight forward, they tend to have a little bit of a, car got bumped reaction. But if you fade in as you're already in constant motion, people tend to be pretty good. So when we were moving down halls and changing directions, we would fade out for a quarter of a second, then fade back in when we actually did the direction change, and people were all right as long as you kept that going. But the other thing that we learned from a gameplay perspective is that we needed to control both the angle that the player is facing in the physical world so they don't lose tracking, but also the engagement distance so they don't bump into the wall or kind of go too far away from the tracking, because people really wanted to move around as this was going on. So what now? So we said, let's take the best part of the previous things. The stationary shooter was really good at giving you controlled engagement distances so you can reach out and punch people and stuff like that. And you were always facing the action because we always funneled the action down the alleyway in front of you. The kind of Asian action film approach that we did, the movement around the environment was really cool, and the bombastic action of kind of chaining things together and grabbing guns off people and shooting the other people with them and throwing them at people was really awesome. So then we took those best parts and threw all the rules of sanity out the window and said, since you're already a disembodied set of hands floating around, for some reason killing a bunch of people, why not just let you teleport around? So we weren't the first people to do teleport by far. There's a lot of people that have done a lot of cool videos and stuff talking about the pros and cons of teleporting players around an environment. But the important thing about it is that we can control exactly where the player goes. And because of that, we can limit the content that we need to create because we have a bunch of fixed set pieces, basically. It's a little bit less overwhelming for the player because they're not being pulled through an environment that's having all this stuff happen around them. If they don't feel safe, they can stay in the same place where they are and they don't get disoriented. And it controls the direction that they're facing because when they teleport, we control the camera angle after that. So if you look at the train station in Bullet Train, these are all the teleporters in the direction that they're facing. So all of them actually face in towards the center of the environment because we wanted to have all the action happen in the center of the environment. So since the teleporters always face you towards the action, the player isn't as inclined, I should say, to rotate out of the tracking volume. And for the most part, it works. We used kind of trickery with the AI and stuff to keep them in the center of the map. But what we really wanted to do was make sure that they always kept facing towards the tracker so they wouldn't have their hands fly off. And we always wanted to keep them so they never felt like they had to run around the space because the fact is they can't. So in order to make it feel right, though, we had to go back to the stuff that we learned in the Asian action film, and that was the teleport blink. So when we do the teleport, rather than just kind of plop the player there, we added a brief fade to white that's about a quarter to a third second long. Add a sound that's kind of a whoosh to let the player know that something was happening. And then we left a trail behind, actually, so the player could see where he's coming. So since all these teleporters are kind of facing each other, you're always teleporting kind of across from you. And then when you teleport across, we have this kind of like little trail that catches up to you, and that gives players kind of an instinctual representation of where they were, and that helps them kind of orient them to the new space. It's not perfect, but we found that the combination of having an audio cue, a visual cue, and then something that is a little bit of where you've been made people feel pretty well oriented in the new space. So the next thing we had to tackle was how do you select where you want to teleport? We have 8 of these teleporters around there. And the first thing we did was, hey, the player's looking at something. Let's just, have them hit a button at whatever they're looking at, the closest teleporter, and we'll pop them there. And that worked when you weren't in frantic combat, but when you're getting shot at, people are playing the game and diving all around and looking all over. The last thing they want to do is keep their head looking where they're going to be at. So we moved the teleporter control to the hands. They just had to kind of point at what they wanted to go to. So you can do a bunch of cool things like, hey, I'm engaging this guy, but then I want to teleport over here, and you can see him get blown up while you teleport over to the next section. And that actually worked pretty well. It was a lot more natural than people trying to do fine-grained motor control with their neck, because we find in a lot of the gaze-based interactions, people aren't used to controlling their head to a very, very fine degree. You know, we have large kind of gross movement with the neck. So pointing at things is a much more natural interaction than trying to have people strain their necks and look at where they want to go. Plus, when the action is kind of hot and heavy, it gets a little difficult to kind of maintain the player's attention. So that kind of gave us solved the location stuff and keeping people looking towards the tracker. But you know, we couldn't get that awesome action moment kind of melee combat that we had in the action film when the people were going through the action. So the teleporters weren't close to the enemies. The enemies would have to come to you. And that, you know, it was cool to shoot them from a distance, but it was so much fun to grab the guns out of people's hands or punch the guys or grab them and throw them that we really wanted to get that back. So when watching more Asian action films purely for research, we noticed that, you know, all the time when these people fight, they kind of start far out and then they get close to each other and they're in the hand-to-hand kind of action combat distance, and then they break apart and then they go back to that engagement distance. So we decided just, hey, why not throw a teleporter on the people and then teleport them facing the enemy at the proper engagement distance so they can reach out and grab guns and stuff, but they're still always facing towards the trackers. So it kind of allowed people to, you know, reach out and punch someone, for lack of a better term, and kept the kind of combos where you can throw your pistol at somebody, knock them out, and then teleport to them and grab the pistol out of the air and shoot the next guy. Those kind of combos were really important to kind of the discoverability and making it something that people wanted to come back and keep playing and mess around with and get that kind of toy box feel. So teleporters are nice, but they're not without their own open issues. The reorientation can confuse some players, especially people that aren't very used to VR. We try to do everything we can, but you know, there's just some percentage of the audience that doesn't get it in the 5 minutes that they play the demo for the first time. And a lot of people still really want to move around their local space, some more than others. We've had one guy that did a combat roll into the computer while he was wearing the headset. Other people's just jumping back and, you know, ripping the cord out of the laptop. People get really, really into it, which is awesome. It's hilarious to watch. But I don't know how you can, you know, other than giving them some tranks before you play the game, I don't know how we're going to contain people. The other problem is, since we did have to go back to having an actual AI, the action doesn't always keep in the center, especially when players are teleporting all the way around. The AI can't react fast enough to get back in front of the player. And quite frankly, a lot of people, especially people that aren't used to action movies or action games, simply forget they can do it because they're so concerned with all the bullets and stuff flying around them. So open issues, more people are working on it. I saw budget cuts. There's a trailer that they released a couple of days or maybe last week where they're bringing the camera up through the teleporter and stuff like that. I think there's a lot of promise in this, but we still need to kind of experiment and feel around to see if we can solve the kind of last lingering issues. And so just a quick bonus lesson. In Bullet Train, there's a slow-mo mechanic where you can slow down everything and go into kind of like bullet time. But we also have the teleport mechanics. So originally, those were on two different buttons. You'd press the top button to teleport and the bottom button to slow down. And that was actually kind of confusing to people. And we didn't think it would be very confusing because the gameplay loop in Bullet Train is super simple. I mean, all you can really do is grab stuff, shoot stuff, and do the slow-mo and the teleport. So we figured 4 actions was manageable for people. But trying to keep track of so many buttons was actually just kind of overwhelming, especially since people don't have that intuitive feel of the controllers. This was a lot of people's first time using the touch controllers. It's not like an Xbox or a PlayStation controller that people kind of have instinctual muscle memory on. So we had to simplify it even more, and so we ended up combining the slow-mo and the teleport onto the same button so that players only had to grab stuff, shoot stuff, and then do the slow-mo teleports. So as the lesson that we learned from that basically is, are control cords and cords hitting multiple buttons at the same time worth it in VR? We think so, but not yet until people get more familiarity and muscle memory with the controllers and the interfaces. People will figure it out, but you know, people are still struggling to remember that they have to hold down the grip in order to keep holding onto the weapon. So until those sorts of problems are solved, we're going to kind of temper our expectations and keep things as simple as possible. And speaking of grabbing and holding on to things, one of the things that we noticed was people, when they were reaching out to grab things, never actually made it to the thing that they wanted to grab. People kind of tended to stop a few inches short and not actually get it. So one of the things we did was, you can see well, the lights are up a little bit, but this is the player's hand, and it's tracing to try to grab the AK that's on the table. We actually have a little bit of a cylinder that we do a trace out, and it's much more forgiving. It goes about 2.5 to 3 feet away from the player and is very forgiving in what they're aiming at. And we did that because we wanted them to be able just to look at something, stick their hand out and grab it without having to worry about reaching all the way down there. Don't want them to get off balance when they have something on their headset. Things like that. And it had an added bonus of making people feel like, badasses when a gun is flying over their head. If they reach out and flail for it, it sucks when you miss that. You feel lame. But if you can actually reach out and grab it, it's awesome. So people started having more fun when they did that because they could start flipping guns around and doing all that sort of fun, crazy stuff. So now we know how we're going to get around the environment, but kind of what about the gameplay? And we decided to have a few classes of weapons. We have kind of shotgun, pistol, assault rifle, grenades, and rockets. But kind of how do we make those feel awesome and different than just a standard first-person shooter? And so the answer to that was we wanted to make you feel just like a badass, right? We decided not to have death in the game. We only wanted you to feel more like Neo from the Matrix. So we decided early on failure is not an option, right? We want everybody to go through the demo, have fun. Your stuff's always blowing up around you. Action's always happening. You can never really screw up. You can only get better at it. So we added lots of invisible helpers to kind of make people feel more badass. The first one was that grip so that people could grab stuff out of the air and do a lot of cool tricks, gun juggling and that. But also we noticed that people felt really good when they threw a rocket or threw a grenade from way far and actually hit the guy on the head, or threw their pistol and it connected with the enemy and stuff. So we added lots of invisible helpers. And the emphasis on invisible is because nobody likes to be coddled, right? The goat from Jurassic Park, the T-Rex, they kept feeding it with the goat on the chain, and that wasn't good enough for him, so he had to break out and start eating people because it's more fun to hunt than it is to eat a goat on a chain. So the same sort of thing happens in VR, right? If you throw something and you see it dramatically cheat for you, they're like, oh, the game cheated for me. That's no fun. I don't feel cool. But if you can do it in kind of subtle ways and matching the player's expectations, it's a lot more fun because they felt that they did it themselves. So matching the player's expectation with motion controls is really the key. A lot of people, like I suck at football and anything that involves throwing a ball at someplace where it needs to be. So the first thing that we did was, in order to match my expectation of me throwing a grenade and wanting to hit a guy, we have to see what we think the player is aiming at, and then find a flight path that looks plausible in order to get it there so you feel like you made the throw yourself without the game cheating for you. So here's a grossly over-exaggerated video of what that looks like. The grenade will dart almost directly towards him, but it'll give you the idea. So he's going to grab the grenade, go up there and try to throw it in the back. And he hits the guy in the back. There's no way I can make that throw in real life. But you can do it in the game, and it feels awesome when you do it. So the way we did that was we added little components that you could just drop on anything in the world. So the enemies have them on their heads. We put some on trash cans so you can throw grenades and get them in trash cans. There's all sorts of just little places that are targeted. And we have just a cone that comes out of the player's head. We find the thing that we think that they're aiming at, and we compute a velocity and see if we can make it there with a plausible throw arc that looks something like what the player's hand was doing. The key there was tuning it to not be too intrusive and only kind of do it when they really actually threw something at somebody, rather than just always darting straight off towards the enemy. So despite all these systems, sometimes the players still just didn't get certain mechanics in there. And one of those was the boss. He shoots rockets at you, and the idea is you're supposed to grab them and then kind of throw them back at you. So, or throw them back at the boss. So some people got this, and they could grab the rockets, they turn them around and let them go, and they fly directly towards them. But others kind of failed spectacularly. And so when we watched how people were failing doing this through lots of gameplays and lots of new user testing, we noticed most of the time when people, instead of grabbing the rocket and pointing at it and letting go, which is what all of us as designers thought people were going to do, they were trying to throw it like a football or like an overhand throw, right? So the solution is simple, like let's let them throw rockets. So the mechanics of the rocket throw are, if the player grabs the rocket and doesn't just let it go after it's aimed, we take the average of the velocity for the last about half a second to try to figure out what the intent is. So if I throw like this, my motion for the last few seconds is kind of pointing towards that way. So we basically just cheat and say the rocket leaves the hand right there and then just flies up that direction. So people can kind of throw it like a football and it'll actually get there. The key to making this believable, though, was to add a little bit of a visual flourish to make it look less controlled. So if you let go of a rocket, it just shoots straight towards it. But if you do the overhand throw of the rocket, we add this little wobble to it to make it look a little bit uncontrolled and then even out in its flight. And you can kind of see it in this video. The first two will be grabs and returns like we intended or thought players were going to do.
You can
And
grab
then
the
last one
rockets
would be a
and
throw.
aim them at the enemy.
So we just let it go, shoot straight. That's that. That was a hell of a rocket. This one they grabbed and throw, watch how it kind of breaks out. So that helped hide the fact that we were cheating for you. So that got most of the people most of the way there, but some people, and we won't name names except for the CEO of Oculus, Brendan, still had some trouble hitting the targets. So we decided we had to add in homing, but homing from the beginning, it really feels like a cheat because you can see the rocket fly out and then arc up. If you do it too much too early, you know, players that actually have the skill don't have any fun because there's no challenge to it, right? They're just going to hit every time for the first time. But also people are like, oh, that's lame, the rocket's homing. I didn't do anything in order to do this, the game did it for me. So what we did is we started off with no homing, and then every time you fail to hit the boss, it adds about 10% on there. So the first one goes straight, the second one goes mostly straight, and then it starts going up from there. And then by the time you're about 45 seconds in, which feels like a long time in the game, you can it'll come back around and hook and hit the guy in the back. So it's very, very hard to lose the last boss battle. But the key, again, was giving people the expectation at the beginning that they're doing things exactly themselves and then making them feel like they got better as they went on. So we got a bunch of the core mechanics done, but there's kind of that still, it didn't have magic to it. It felt like it was 80% of the way there. We needed something to kind of kick it up the rest. So we decided we needed to do a little bit of investigation and play testing and kind of matching the players' expectations. So what makes them feel badass when they play, see where they're disappointed when they play. We thought initially that just, talking to people after the demo, like, hey, what sucked, what was fun, would do it. But often they just don't tell you directly. Even if they know the answer to themselves, it's not like they're trying to hide stuff for you. But, there's a lot going on in the 5 minutes that they're playing the demo, and they don't often remember it after they get out. So we kind of had this playtest loop, which is super obvious and super stupid. It's not like we invented this or anything, but a lot of people just haven't seen it before. So basically, we implemented a feature, we playtest the crap out of it, and then listen for the ahs and the facial expressions are really the key tell. Even if they don't vocalize, watching somebody's face while they play VR, their mouth expression really tell you when they tried something and they didn't do it or they wanted to do something. You can see the disappointment on their face. And then basically take whatever they were sad about, implement it, and then go back and do it all again. So one of the first things that people tried to do, because everybody's seen The Matrix, is they wanted to slow bullets and then grab them and throw them back. And originally you couldn't do that, but we had a spat of 4 or 5 playtesters almost in a row that tried to grab bullets and throw them back, and they were all disappointed. Nobody mentioned it. That was the key. Nobody mentioned it, but you could see it on their face, and you could see that they tried to do it. So we're like, wouldn't it be a cool surprise if when people actually did it, you could grab the bullet and throw it back? And that turns out to be one of people's favorite mechanics in the game because everybody tries to do it because everybody's seen The Matrix. So in addition to the bullet catching and throwing, it got us a few other things. You can Terminator pump the shotgun. You have to pump it between shots so you can, be like Arnold, go like that. Gun juggling, we made the grabbing a little bit more forgiving so you could juggle pistols and stuff like that. Being able to toss a grenade and shoot it out of the air. And the hand rings in the train, the little subway rings, everybody reached up and tried to boop them at the very beginning, and everybody was really disappointed when we didn't do it, so we added it in, and everybody tries to do it now because naturally people like to boop things. And I had to have a cat gif in there. I had to. So really what we wanted to do was just make a toy box. Oculus made that great toy box demo if you've played that, where there's just a bunch of stuff on a table and you get to play with it and feel like you're a kid. Basically, we wanted to do that, but with lots of guns and explosions, because when people discover something that they weren't expected, they feel like they did it themselves, and it's really fun, rewarding experience. So given all that, switching gears a little bit, now we got the design, how do we build the world? Because all that was done in gray box testing, or at least a good bit of it was done in gray box testing, but we still didn't have the visual bar or anything. So the location constraints were that we wanted something that was kind of architecturally and visually interesting that we could use to show off the power of the Unreal Engine, especially in context of architectural visualization, which is kind of a new market for us that we're trying to get into. We only had 6 weeks to flesh it out, and like I said, the employee was new. He's from the film industry. He's ridiculously talented, but we needed content that could be easily augmented in case he got stuck up trying to learn how to make real-time interactive stuff. And most importantly, it has to fit the gameplay. It had to have multiple locations, vantage points, entry points, and have a danger zone in the middle where the player didn't want to feel like he wanted to go, because our secret was that we had all the circle of teleporters on the outside. We couldn't make the center of that circle someplace where he wanted to go. So a train track is kind of a danger zone because smart people don't like to stand in the train tracks. So our inspiration was RDU, the airport in Raleigh, if anybody's ever been there. Has that kind of really clean, nice wood arches in it and a lot of glass, a very kind of modern aesthetic. And European train stations have these really big indoor covered spaces that we thought would be really cool, because one of the ideas for the boss battle that we had is we wanted to kind of come in and crash the roof and then fly around. So we needed a really big open enclosed space. So early versions of the environment, you can see here, it's kind of got the arch from the European train station, the tracks in the middle, but kind of the wood highlights and the aesthetic of the Raleigh airport. Here's another shot from it. So since we only had 6 weeks to do that, we had to kind of mix and match. So while the majority of the assets were custom for Bullet Train, we did kind of had to lean on buying some assets and then spiff them up for the level. So things like the train exterior, the weapons in there, and the characters were kind of, we grabbed those assets, bought them, and then just did a little bit of, we retextured them and had our modelers add a little more detail and kind of config them to our use. But augmenting, purely custom stuff with a little bit of pre-bought stuff that you customize, it's kind of like, the Sandra Lee semi-homemade stuff, right? It gets the job done and adds a little bit of characteristic to it, but it's so much faster to do that sort of stuff than to make all completely new content. And so all that looks good, but how does it run? And the answer is, out of the box, usually not very good. So our motto is kind of fake it until you make it, and it being frame rate. So we're firm believers that you should get up to at least 90 frames a second from the very beginning, and then stay there through the entire time. So in order to kind of get the visual fidelity we wanted, we had to turn off a lot of the kind of post-process effects and stuff like that, and do a lot of fakery in order to make it look like we had all that stuff turned on when we didn't actually did it. We had to kind of bring back some old school tricks. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? All right, I'll zoom through this stuff and then leave some time for questions. So the reflections in the environment are actually all faked, right? So this is what, if you just place this sign in the level, this is what it would look like. It doesn't have any stuff on the bottom. But the problem with that, and especially in VR, is if you don't have anything like a shadow or reflection to ground the objects in there, you can really, really tell in stereoscopic vision. So we decided, since the environment was all really shiny, we really needed to have fake reflections in there. So with the highly reflective environments, you need to have reflections to ground the actual objects in there. So we leveraged an old trick, which is to use underground proxy geometry. So in this case, we just put a quad that's textured sticking through the floor directly, and then that gives you this kind of really nice reflection. It's a little bit blurred because it's a lower resolution texture, and that looks all right if you just leave it like that. But one of the things that really made it more visually interesting is when it kind of gets messed up a little bit because the surface isn't flat. It's got little crevices and tiles and stuff in it. So since we have a deferred renderer, we have all the information about the normals in the G-buffer already available to us for free. So with the faked reflections, we basically say, hey, let's take the difference between what a perfect, Z-up normal surface would be, and then what we actually get from the G-buffer. So if it's on a tile that's slightly canted, that would be this part. Subtract the two to get the difference, and then just kind of warp the reflection there, and then it warps it based on, if there's a tile or a crack or something right there. It makes it look really good. And there's been a lot of kind of discussion about, deferred rendering versus forward rendering. Forward rendering is a lot cheaper out of the box. Deferred rendering, you kind of pay a base cost. But our approach to it is we really try to leverage all that data that's in the G-buffer to do these kind of cool tricks. And it makes up for the kind of initial base pass time. So, you spend a few milliseconds generating that G-buffer, but you got so much data you can pull in there to try to fake this sort of stuff that it really pays for itself. We did the same thing for the characters, actually. These reflections are completely fake. And I actually didn't realize that until a week before we shipped. I thought they just did real reflections, but the way we did that was kind of an extension of the same technique. So we put one card for each foot in there, and then kind of positioned it and scaled it based on where the leg was and if he was, had his foot on the ground versus above the ground. And then we actually blended between a screen capture of the guy's legs facing completely forward and one that's complete facing 90 degrees, and then blended between the two in the vertex shader so that it was almost free for us because we don't have a lot of vertex shader pressure on it. We can get these sort of things for nearly no cost, and they look really good. The next thing we did, sorry, I'm skipping through this because we're running out of time, is flattening materials. So this is a trick that we took from a mobile pipeline. We have some tools in the engine where you can take a bunch of textures and a really complex material and bake it down to a much smaller set of textures with fewer instructions. So we did that. This is the guy before, and this is the guy after, and you can tell there's very little visual difference other than whatever that big red thing in the background is. In there, but the trick is this was 5 materials, and so 5 draw calls with 270 instructions per material, and this guy was 2 materials with 77 instructions per material. This is the shader complexity view of that, so you can see that this guy is red to white hot, where this guy is green. So before this change, we could have 1 AI on the screen, and after that, we got about 7 to 8 on screen without blowing our lighting budget. And I'll show you one last trick since we're running out of time, and then I'll open it up for questions. So if I can get it to play. So the dynamic lights in the subway, as you enter and you're in a subway train, and to get that sense of motion, these lights on the ground were super, super important. And originally they did that with 77 dynamic lights, which was a little costly for the scene to run at 90 frames a second. So what we ended up doing was kind of fake it by using a mask texture. So we took the lights, basically what the shadow map would be generated from outside the train, and just projected that manually so we didn't have to recompute that every time since the geometry wasn't actually changing. And then we used a modulate material to project that onto the scene, color it to the blue for the left side, red for the right side, and then added a skew shader to it to kind of make it blend out there so it looks like it was coming from a point light source. And then we normalized it from 0 to 1, so 0 would have the light coming from back here shining this way, 1 would have it from here, and 0.5 would be shining directly in, and then just pan that constant on the material. So everything was done in the pixel shader, and we didn't have to worry about the shadow rendering scene setup costs and all that. And that let us do that with just those 2 materials, 1 for each side, and then 2 dynamic lights just to add a little bit of color on the very, very top. So that was what made that scene possible. So with that, I'll skip the technical improvements. They're awesome. If you want them, they're all in version 4.11 of UE4. It saved us about 3 milliseconds total time for free without any visual degradation. And that's it. So if anybody has any questions, happy to answer while I have a few moments. Any questions? We good? Yep.
How many people work on the bullet train?
So it was a 10-week total project. And for the first 4 weeks of that, there was me and a designer for that kind of, and well, no speaker, sussing out the gameplay. And then for 6 weeks, we ramped up to a team of an average size of about 10. We had one day where we had 18 when we stole a bunch of particle system authors so we could try to fill that stuff in. But I would say about average of 10 for 6 weeks, and then 3 people kind of doing prototype, trying to figure out the gameplay before then.
Very stupid question. When you guys work on something like this, do you guys work with the released version of Unreal, or you guys are like?
Yeah, we start with the release version of Unreal because we know it's highly stable. So if you're working out of the main line, it's a little bit rough sometimes because there's active development on features. And since it's such a short-term project and there's so many people involved, we couldn't afford any of those delays. So we work off the release version and then add the improvements like this instant stereo rendering, which we merge back to the next version of release version, but they're all built on top of the current release version. The Bullet Train was built off of 410. Anybody else? All right, we're good. Thank you.